This is part two of what is intuition, resonance, connection, and trusting intuition on its own terms. I'm Emily Sadowski, PhD. This is a video where I read my book aloud. And this is chapter one, Speaking the Unspeakable. Since 2008, I have worked as a scholar of education and transformation, studying and teaching about knowledge and knowledge production, theories of learning, and what it takes to transform how we relate to and understand the world. One theme that has always followed me around different teaching and research positions from London, England to Vancouver, British Columbia, is contained in the question, how do people learn to become different from how they are? In other words, how do people change? These questions are important beyond the scope of my chosen field of study, philosophy of education. We can think about them individually, directing them inward to inform self development. How can I become the person I believe I could be? How can I be more of who I am? For teachers, therapists, coaches, and community and business leaders, these are professional questions that arise every day with practical and existential implications. We can also think about these questions collectively. These days, understanding the process of collective change and transformation seems more important than anything else. If you're paying even a little bit of attention, it's not hard to see that our collective ways have led us towards the brink of literal existential disaster. Extractive colonial capitalism threatens ecological sustainability, the very sustaining we need to continue living on this planet. Some of us trace the state of our collective as resulting from being disconnected from a sense of place, a sense of purpose or meaning, or from a relationship to something greater than ourselves. Others are more explicit. Climate chaos, inequality, and even many violent conflicts all arise from an approach to understanding the world through the lens of rational analysis. After years of thinking about personal and collective transformation, I've come to understand that questions of change or transformation can never be separated from the culture, community, or context in which people live and work. In other words, what we believe, what we know, and the range of potential we recognize as being possible for ourselves individually and collectively are all shaped by our relationships and our beliefs about the world. So, what does this have to do with intuition? A lot, as it turns out. Between 2011 and 2017, I found myself studying leadership and transformation in a faculty of education, in a program that looked at teaching and learning through the lenses of culture, consciousness, and ecology. There, researching questions about the aims of education, what we teach and why, and more importantly, what we don't teach, I became increasingly interested in what gets left out of the curriculum, either on purpose or by sins of omission. This is where my interest in intuition development was sparked. I would regularly encounter the idea that intuition is a key characteristic of mindful, skillful leaders. Intuition would show up in my research about how to best teach in support of developing students' leadership, agency, and self awareness. Intuition was clearly an important ingredient in teaching, learning, and simply living a good life. Yet it occurred to me that I had never once encountered the concept of intuition throughout all my years of schooling. Growing up, the word intuition was not in my vocabulary, nor anywhere in my sphere of awareness. I didn't hear the word at school, and I never heard the idea in my family home. No one ever spoke to me about the ability to hear my inner voice, or to just know, or about relying on inner wisdom to make decisions or to make sense of situations. I definitely wasn't aware of the possibility for psychic intuitive experience. If anything, I was probably surrounded by people who ignored their intuitive feelings to make way for being acceptable or rational. I mean, I must have known that intuition exists. I had heard about gut feelings and knew that they're supposed to be trusted, but I'm not sure that I ever had one. As a young adult, I had read about intuitive and psychic experiences in New Age books, like the Celestine Prophecy. I remember borrowing a roommate's book by New Age self help author Sonia Choquette that taught people how to recognize and trust their vibes. That book was filled with anecdotes and written by a great storyteller, and I devoured it in an afternoon. I loved the idea that people could be more intuitive, even if I didn't catch on that it could apply to me. That whole time, I didn't think I knew much about intuition, but in retrospect, I was having intuitive experiences all the time, just without the vocabulary to know that's what it was. My close friend and I shared a connection we called the hippie phone. Sometimes we would inadvertently call each other at the very same moment. Other times, one of us would be thinking of the other and then get a call or text soon after. I now know that experiences like this are fairly common. Even accounting for confirmation bias, many people report telephone telepathy as a feature of their close connections. For me, experiencing the hippie phone was a clue that I was connected to a field of awareness that teachers like Choquette and others spoke about, even when I didn't have a concrete way of integrating what they pointed to. Well, it might seem strange coming from someone who has studied and written about intuition for over a decade. I never thought of myself as particularly intuitive. My intuitive capacity ebbs and flows. I'm intuitive in some ways and less so in others. For instance, I'm pretty consistent in being able to see the big picture and in perceiving connections between things. But the aha moments and sudden certain awarenesses are less frequent in my experience. The truth is, my intuitive function continues to evolve. For many years, intuition would show up for me in the form of library angels. That's what I called my knack for coming across just the right title on a bookshelf that would get me to the next place in my research. I've played with this ability sometimes, wandering through the stacks at a library or a bookstore until feeling drawn to certain title or series. Other times, I've had strong intuitive hits about my personal safety, like the feeling I should take a different route home from my usual one. I always try to follow these inclinations and assume that they're helping me avoid harm. But of course, there's no way to confirm that they're real, since we can only know of what actually happens, not what might have. Now that I teach and coach others to feel more connected to their intuition, something I hear from clients a lot is that they know their intuition in retrospect. They realize later that they just knew, but at the time didn't make the connection. Often those experiences don't register because, like me, people don't realize they're intuitive. But when we dig in and create a personal history of intuitive experiences, it turns out there have been moments throughout most people's lives where their intuition showed up. They just maybe didn't recognize it as such. Okay, do me a favor. Take a minute to think back across your life. Do you have any personal anecdotes about intuition? When did you or someone you know have an uncanny intuitive hit? I'm pretty confident that whether you listened at the time or not, you'll have at least a couple stories about intuition in your pocket. When I really started studying intuition and psychic development, my own intuitive hits started coming in faster, more often, and more clearly. I remember one day in the fall of 2011, I had just been to the library and was sitting among my haul of books, books about cultivating creativity, about the energetic center at the heart, and about how and why intuition is valuable to teachers, business leaders, and creatives. Sitting among my books and notebooks, I suddenly thought about some other books I had recently ordered online. I wondered to myself, when were those supposed to be delivered again? Not a minute later, the doorbell rang upstairs. The books were being delivered. Cool, right? A similar thing happened with telephone telepathy. I started getting really good at guessing who that text was from before looking at the phone. And more often, I'd think of someone and moments later get a call from them. All of this just knowing was uncanny. I had no way to explain what was happening within my limited way of making sense of the world. I realized I needed to try to understand these intuitive experiences through a more expansive lens. Intuition became a more conscious personal factor for me when I first learned to practice Reiki, an energetic healing modality with roots in Japan. The induction ritual to Reiki is a series of attunements that connects individuals to the Reiki energy, and I received my first attunement in July 2005. Immediately after that induction, I noticed a small but insistent awareness that let me know things in an intuitive way. The very next day, as usual, I went to work at my sales job in a store. I remember taking a call from a customer who wanted to give her order over the phone. We went through the regular procedure. I took her phone number and we confirmed the product code. But as I was hanging up, I suddenly knew that something was going to get messed up with this order. There was nothing specific that led me to know this, just an insistent general awareness that I would need to follow up on something. Sure enough, it turned out the item she had ordered was no longer available. Later that same day, while occupied with something else in the showroom, I heard the phone ring in the background of my awareness. Again with the phone. Instantly, I thought, oh, that's my dad calling. And I was right. There really was no reason for me to think that. The store's phone rang 100 times a day, and my dad rarely called me at work. But there it was, the subtle but certain awareness, almost heard as a voice in my head, letting me know things I had no reason to know. These are small and maybe insignificant examples of intuitive experiences, but the information I intuited that day is less important than the fact that I had access to it in the first place. I now understand that the Reiki attunement had connected me to my intuitive sense by enhancing my awareness of energy itself. Beyond the information I was accessing, what's significant is that I was having the experience from within of sudden, certain, accurate intuitive knowing. I had become more connected with the energetic fields around me, or maybe it's more accurate to say I became more sensitive to being connected with the consciousness of the universe at large, and it was paying off in intuitive experience. Now, this is not a book about Reiki, and I'm not saying that Reiki is what you need to become more in touch with your intuition. I won't be suggesting that learning any one modality is the way to cultivate intuitive awareness. But usually we do need something to remind us of the connection we can have with the energy of the universe. Reiki worked for me like a fast road to developing my intuition. I had been disconnected from this sensitivity within myself. Truly, most people living in the overdeveloped global north are disconnected from the subtle realms of experience. We simply don't have space for psychic experience in our frames of reference. I needed a boost of resonance, and a Reiki attunement provided it for me. Some of you will have an intuitive connection that's more resilient, that doesn't wane despite cultural practices that try to eliminate our awareness of it, even withstanding a whole education system that requires us to ignore energy, tells us spooky stories about it, and encourages us to look for answers anywhere but within. Maybe you've been able to resist this inculcation into the rational analytic mode. But even if you consider yourself intuitive, it's often kept separate. Like a Clark Kent Superman situation, our intuition is something we do privately without anyone else knowing, and we don't credit it. For me, learning Reiki let me experience my intuition in a new way. Reiki helped me experience my intuition by opening up a range of neglected perceptive possibility based in a deepened relationship between myself and my surroundings. My supercharged intuitive experience didn't last, by the way. I didn't suddenly become psychic like a character in a movie would have, and after a while, those experiences happened less often. It was only after some time practicing Reiki, developing a regular meditation practice, and cultivating the inner energetic body that I've developed a sustained sensitivity to that resonance of vibes. I'd later learned that this inner work is known to support intuitive development, and that almost any meditative, inner directed mind body practice supports intuition, which makes sense, knowing what I now do about what intuition is and how it works. My intuitive capacity showed up because the attunement ritual and anchoring it through practice had ignited an awareness in me of the energetic resonance between myself, the knower, and knowledge, the known. I was able to perceive information as if it came from within, experiencing a continuity between myself and not myself, between experience and information, between immediacy and distance. By experiencing the vibrational patterns of energy through my body, I perceived information moving as energy, flowing throughout matter, even crossing the boundaries of time and space. Clearly, there was a connection between intuition and the role of energy, consciousness, and context that my upbringing and education had neglected to let me know about. In retrospect, I see that studying intuition was a roundabout way to understand and unpack this very connection, which reflects a paradigmatic shift I see happening in the world more broadly. One that's bringing forward the role of unseen energy, interconnectedness, and relatedness in how we construct our framing of the world around us. I'm going to stop there for now. I'll see you again in part 3.